You'll see in your problem set also what I would call authenticity rents, which is just people's belief that two otherwise identical products, if produced by someone who is the original, is worth more, right? And this is really one of the oldest tools of economic policy. It dates at least back to the 7th century BCE in Greece, where when they held these big festivals, someone who produced a really good dish would have the exclusive right to produce that dish for the next year. And today we're going to learn some trade-offs about the design of intellectual property and their relationship to the punishment of crime. So I'm going to start by talking about what monopoly profits incentivize firms to do, and use that to think about the notion of creative destruction. Daiichi, here's your problem set back. You can work on it more. I'll then talk about the static and dynamic effects of crime, the optimal enforcement of laws, and then I'll draw a relationship between that and intellectual property. I'll then talk about innovation incentives versus the ex post distortion that IP creates, and use that to derive a model of optimal intellectual property. Talk about comparative statics of optimal intellectual property and its lessons for policy, and then give a little bit of a broader perspective. Okay. So far, we viewed monopoly profits as basically being transfers, and therefore being benign from a total welfare perspective. And our sort of initial inclination was, well, the firms are really rich, so we want to take the money away from them and redistribute to other people, right? But monopoly rents and profits encourage people to pursue monopoly. And while some of these might be left as just pure rents to the people who get them, and therefore we should think about them in terms of redistribution, there may be a substantial elasticity of economic activity with respect to these. And if that's large, then we should see more monopoly. We should see monopoly more as a price, monopoly profits more as a price than as a rent, right? That is, what the price incentivizes people to do obviously depends on the way in which the monopoly was obtained, and that's really what we should be thinking about when we consider the effects of monopoly. So this activity could be pure waste or rent seeking, in which case the monopoly's profits are themselves a deadweight loss, not just the monopoly distortion, because the monopoly profits will incentivize wasteful activity that will eat up those profits, right? On the other hand, the rents from monopoly might incentivize the creation of new valuable markets and products, in which case the monopolist who only captures the profit will create a net positive externality. And that really makes, that entrepreneurial externality makes the monopoly profit something we should really like in that case, because it's encouraging the creation of beneficial externalities, right? So in many cases, this is crucial because the monopoly profits are themselves much bigger than the deadweight loss. In the classic monopoly scenario, this is true with some demand functions. But more importantly, when we get into oligopoly, you'll see that the deadweight loss is going to get much smaller compared to the profits. Because basically it's a triangle, whereas the monopoly profit is sort of this rectangle. So unless this gets very big, the monopoly profit is going to be a more important component of the way that welfare is divided up than is the deadweight loss triangle. Okay. So we talked briefly earlier about ways of getting monopoly, including protection by the government from lobbying, like licensure, chartered corporations. And this sort of thing is really only useful, and in fact, this is the way it was often used before, if it's valuable to the country in terms of raising prices at the monopoly level. So often countries during the 18th century had monopolies on certain products for export or import so as to try to extract more revenue from the countries they were interacting with. Sometimes monopoly arises from private or illegal violence. So mafia controls many illegal industries, and sometimes exclusionary antitrust practices can also help obtain a monopoly. A third case is forming an illegal cartel in a legal industry, right? So antitrust laws prevent this, but in the Europe and the EU, they didn't used to prevent this, and it used to be legal to form a cartel. And in fact, you still see cartels forming even though it is illegal, such as in the vitamin industry. There's a famous movie about that from the 90s. Mergers can also be a way to form market power. The government reviews these, but it doesn't always veto every merger that ends up being anti-competitive. And in some countries, mergers are just purely legal. So when the Peruvians opened their market up to the United States, rather than more competition coming in, as many people claimed, actually US capital came in, bought up all the Peruvian beer producers and cartelized the industry and raised prices. And another natural form of a monopoly, source of monopoly position, is some form of intellectual property. So a natural thing to ask is, what activities are encouraged or incentivized by each of these forms of monopoly? So protection by the government encourages expenditures on lobbying, cozying up to politicians. And that might be bad if it happens through payments to politicians, but it might not be quite as bad if the firm, in order to influence politicians, can't just give them money, but instead has to do some socially productive activity to persuade the government that it deserves its position. So for example, the Bell telephone company put a huge amount of money into research that was very socially valuable, probably in order to try to maintain its monopoly position, because it thought that if it didn't do these socially valuable things, that people would no longer support their maintaining their monopoly, right? A second form of obtaining monopoly is private or illegal violence. And this is a very bad source of monopoly power, because it encourages all sorts of violent activities to go on. So the fact that there's market power in the drug industry has been killing tens of thousands of people every year in Mexico, right? Because those profits are things that people really want to try to obtain. Illegal cartels may encourage waste on enforcing the cartel illegally, right? Because you may spend a lot of resources, given that it's not legal, trying to enforce that cartel arrangement. But otherwise, it's very similar to a merger. And the question is, what does a merger encourage, right? Well, it might result in some diseconomies of scale. That might be a form of waste. But it might also encourage what's called entry for buyout. And you'll see exactly what I mean by that on your upcoming problem set. Intellectual property, which is the main thing we're going to talk about today, can encourage a lot of good things, which is what we're going to focus on today. It can also encourage some bad things. So you might try to steal someone's idea or just beat them to get something so you get a patent to exclude them. And that might be a wasteful thing encouraged by intellectual property. So Joseph Schumpeter emphasized the importance of these ex-ante incentive effects of monopoly power rather than just the static distortions. He said that what was most important for making an economy work was innovation and technical progress, and that the static distortions were likely to be relatively small. That really the creative power of capitalism was the way it had transformed the technology available to society, not any short-term losses by reducing products, or short-term gains by reducing the profits that firms make in order to try to increase output. Now, of course, that seems very true in the long run of history. Once you discount things properly, it's probably somewhat less true, but I think there's a lot of spirit in that argument that seems to be right. Yeah, Mohammed.
By short term, like you mean over the period of like intellectual property, like 20 years or something? Is that short term?
Yeah. Or just once goods have been created, the fact that you might reduce their consumption a little bit. He claims that that's a very small effect relative to the benefits that we get from all these products constantly being created.
I was just concerned because he's talking about like short term, and until the monopoly is there, that like constantly we're gonna have that shortcoming of like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure short term is really the right word for it. I would call it ex post. Once the product is created, the distortion that exists. Because, over any term, there's going to be some innovation and some ex post stuff. So it's really more about ex ante versus ex post rather than, or you don't even have to call it ex ante or ex post. You could just call it incentives to create products versus incentives to produce the product once it's created, right? So he says many of the most important issues that I think arise in industrial economics have to do with the competitive process rather than the exact production of goods afterwards. So Daichi, what did Schumpeter say about the process of competition?
What is that question?
So what was Schumpeter's description of the process of competition, of what's so great about capitalism, what happens as industries develop?
That there's going to be always like a race for innovation, like new technologies taking over others, and there's creative destruction.
Yeah, exactly. So that the key thing about innovation is that the real threats to monopoly are not someone else coming in and producing the same product, but someone coming and completely eliminating the necessity for the market, right? And that, quote, comfortable monopolists are often left behind by new technologies. And the most important goal of a dynamic economy is to incentivize this sort of creative destruction. And that itself might actually require some market power and concentration in order to incentivize people to seek monopoly power through that innovation, right? So industrial policy, industrial economics, he would argue, should not be focused on reducing monopoly distortions or regulation, but rather on creating, incentivizing the creation of new products. And I think that this image resonates very well with high-tech industry. So, Facebook and previous Facebook came in, and it basically completely swept away the market for all of the previous competitors, despite the fact that those people were first to market. Apple has continuously come up with products that have sort of completely changed the texture of the industry rather than just competed with existing products. Now, that doesn't always happen, as the iPad mini, I think, is a good example, but it often does. Yeah, Chrissy.
But to what extent does Apple face a problem with it creatively destroying its own products? That's like one thing that I kind of wonder, like they have to really
that's one argument. In fact, there's a paper that I refereed pretty recently that argues that competition, a main benefit of competition, is that it can reduce the incentives that firms have to hold back innovations to avoid cannibalizing their own products, right? So that's one reason why competition can be beneficial to innovation. But it can be harmful to innovation if it reduces the profits that firms can expect to get after entering, right? So both of the effects go in both directions. Google was a latecomer to the search market, actually, by a few years.